The diner buzzed with the usual lunchtime rush. Plates clattering, coffee cups clinking, and the low hum of conversation filling the air. A man in a worn leather jacket and a military cap sat alone in a corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. His posture was straight, disciplined, but there was exhaustion in his eyes, like someone who had seen too much. Across the room, a waitress lingered by the counter, arms crossed, a scowl tightening her lips. "I'm not serving him," she muttered under her breath. The owner, disguised as just another customer in the next booth over, lowered his newspaper. His sharp gaze flickered from the waitress to the veteran, then back again. His expression hardened. The diner had always prided itself on kindness and respect, but something about the waitress's tone sent a ripple of unease through him. Then, as if sensing the weight of judgment, the veteran quietly set his cup down, cleared his throat, and started to rise from his seat. His presence, it seemed, unwelcome. The owner watched unseen, his pulse steady but his decision already made. He would not let this go. Tom Reynolds had built this diner from the ground up. 15 years ago, after retiring from the military, he had poured his heart and soul into this place, turning it into more than just a restaurant. It was a second home for many. Regulars knew each other by name. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon greeted customers before they even stepped through the door, and the warm lighting gave the place a sense of familiarity, like an old friend. But Tom wasn't just the owner. He was a quiet observer, a man who preferred to blend into the background and watch how people treated one another when they thought no one was looking. He didn't wear a uniform or bark orders like he had in the service. Instead, he chose to move among his customers and staff, sometimes sitting in a booth with a newspaper, sometimes rolling up his sleeves to help in the kitchen. Today, he had opted for the former, an unassuming customer, a man watching the world move around him. His employees were like family, most of them at least. There was Maria, the head cook, who had been with him since the beginning. She was as fiery as the grill she worked over, always keeping things moving with a sharp tongue but a heart of gold. Then there was Riley, the young waiter with an easygoing smile, who could charm even the most irritable customers. And then there was Jess, new, brash, and clearly unimpressed by the place. She had been hired just a few weeks ago, and though she did her job well enough, Tom had noticed an edge to her. She avoided small talk. Her customer service felt forced, and more than once, he had caught her rolling her eyes when she thought no one was watching. The diner wasn't just another job for Tom. It was a place built on respect. That's why, when he overheard Jess refusing to serve the veteran, something inside him tensed. The man in question, an older gentleman with graying hair under his military cap, had come in several times before. He was always polite, never asked for much, just a cup of coffee, sometimes a meal if he looked like he'd had a rough day. Tom didn't know his full story, but he didn't need to. A man who had served deserved respect, no questions asked. Now, watching as Jess made a face and turned her back on the veteran, Tom set his paper down. His decision was made. He was about to teach her and everyone else in the diner a lesson they wouldn't forget. Tom watched as a veteran, his grip tightening around his coffee mug, slowly pushed himself to his feet. His shoulders were stiff, his movements careful, as if carrying an invisible weight. I can just pay and go," the man murmured, his voice rough but dignified. Jess scoffed, crossing her arms. "Yeah, maybe that's for the best." Silence fell over the nearby tables. Riley, who had been refilling a customer's drink, froze mid-pour. Even Maria peeked out from the kitchen, her brow furrowing. The tension in the room was thick, but no one spoke. Tom exhaled slowly, pressing his palms against the tabletop before rising from his booth. This wasn't just rudeness. It was a test of everything his diner stood for. "Sit down," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. The veteran hesitated, glancing between Tom and Jess, before slowly sinking back into his seat. Jess blinked. "Excuse me?" Tom turned to her, his gaze level. "You're refusing to serve a paying customer, Jess shifted uncomfortably, her jaw tightening. Look, I just don't want to deal with... With what? Tom pressed. A man who served his country. Jess looked around as if searching for support, but the other employees avoided her gaze. A few regulars murmured amongst themselves. Jess huffed, throwing up her hands. I don't see why I should have to serve someone like him. The words echoed in the diner, heavier than the midday air. Tom felt a slow burn in his chest. Not just anger, but disappointment. He had seen many things in his life, but blatant disrespect in his own establishment? That was unacceptable. He inhaled deeply, keeping his voice measured. Jess, take off your apron. She blinked. What? You're done here. Her face paled. Wait, you're firing me? Over this. Tom nodded. This isn't just about one moment. It's about respect. You don't belong in a place that values kindness if you can't show it yourself. Jess looked stunned. But before she could protest, Tom turned to Riley. Take over her tables. Without another word, he grabbed a menu, walked over to the veteran's table, and sat across from him. Order anything you want, Tom said, sliding the menu toward him. It's on the house. The man hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly before he nodded in quiet gratitude. Around them, the tension slowly dissolved. Conversations resumed. The clinking of silverware returned, and Maria disappeared back into the kitchen. But something had shifted in the air, a lesson learned, a stand taken. Tom leaned back in his seat, watching as Jess stormed out the door. He didn't regret his decision. If anything, he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Tom sat across from the veteran, studying the lines on the man's face, the quiet way he held himself. There was gratitude in his eyes, but also something else, hesitation. You didn't have to do that, the man said, his voice low. Tom shrugged. Yeah, I did. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the background hum of the diner. Tom waited, giving the man space to speak if he wanted to. After a long pause, he finally did. Name's Daniel, the veteran said, glancing down at his hands. Daniel Carter. Tom extended his hand. Tom Reynolds. Daniel took it, his grip firm but weary. Tom could tell the man wasn't used to accepting kindness. Eat first, talk later, Tom said, nodding toward Maria, who had already started preparing something special. It wasn't long before she slid a plate in front of Daniel, steak and eggs, cooked just right. As Daniel took his first careful bites, Tom leaned back, exhaling. The tension from earlier still sat heavy in his chest. He had never liked firing people, but he didn't regret letting Jess go. What he did regret was not noticing her attitude sooner. Had there been signs? Had she treated other customers the same way? As if reading his mind, Riley slid into the seat next to Tom. Boss, I hate to say it, but that wasn't the first time she's done something like that. Tom's jaw tightened. What do you mean? Riley hesitated, lowering his voice. She never pulled anything that obvious, but she'd ignore certain customers, take forever bringing their orders, especially if they looked like they were struggling. She just didn't care. He sighed. I should have told you sooner. Tom shook his head. No, I should have seen it. Maria, who had overheard, chimed in from behind the counter. You can't catch everything, Tom, but you handled it. Tom nodded, but the weight of responsibility lingered. His diner was supposed to be a place of respect, a place where no one was turned away. And yet, he had let something like this slip under his nose. A deeper look into Daniel's struggles. Across from him, Daniel was eating slowly, methodically, as if savoring each bite. Tom could tell it had been a while since he'd had a hot meal. You come around here often? Tom asked. Daniel wiped his mouth with a napkin before answering. Once in a while. He hesitated, then admitted, didn't expect to be staying in town this long. Tom recognized that tone, one of a man with nowhere to go. You got family around here. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. Used to. Not anymore. Tom didn't pry, but he understood. He'd served with men who had come back to nothing. No job, no home, no support. Some had families who had moved on. Others simply found the world different from the one they had left. "You looking for work?" Tom asked after a moment. Daniel's eyes flickered with something close to embarrassment. "I haven't had much luck." Tom nodded slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "How about you help out around here for a while? Nothing fancy, just small stuff. Fixing things up, keeping the place in shape. I could use an extra set of hands." Daniel looked up, studying him carefully. "You offer me a job. I'm offering you a start." A long silence followed. Then, finally, Daniel gave a small nod. "All right." The first days of work. The next morning, Daniel showed up early, just as the sun began to peek over the rooftops. Tom found him waiting outside the diner, standing straight despite the cold. "You're early," Tom said. "Old habits," Daniel replied with a hint of a smile. Tom let him in and handed him a rag. "All right, first lesson. Maria's in charge of the kitchen. You listen to her. No exceptions." Daniel chuckled. "Understood." Maria greeted him with her usual no-nonsense attitude. "Hope you're not afraid of a little grease." Daniel shook his head. "I've had worse." At first, he stuck to small tasks. Fixing a broken chair, cleaning up around the diner, helping Riley carry heavy boxes. He didn't complain, never asked for anything, and always worked with quiet determination. But the real challenge came when he had to interact with customers. One afternoon, a woman accidentally spilled her coffee. Daniel, who had been cleaning nearby, instinctively reached for napkins and knelt to help. But the moment she saw him, she hesitated. "It's all right. I can clean it up," she said quickly. Daniel stiffened, as if expecting rejection. Tom, who had been watching, stepped in. "Daniel works here," he said simply. The woman's posture relaxed, and she offered a small smile. "Oh, well, thank you." Daniel nodded, his hands still steady. But Tom saw the flicker of something deeper, relief. A setback. Not everything went smoothly. One evening, after the rush had died down, Daniel lingered near the back door, staring out into the darkened street. Tom approached, leaning against the frame. "Something on your mind?" Daniel hesitated before exhaling. I don't know if I belong here." Tom studied him. "What makes you say that?" Daniel looked down at his hands, flexing them as if testing their worth. "It's been a long time since I felt useful." Tom understood. He'd felt it himself after leaving the service. That restless feeling, like you were a piece of something bigger, and now you didn't know where you fit. "You are useful," Tom said simply. "You just haven't had the chance to see it yet." Daniel didn't answer, but the next day, he showed up again, earlier than before. A small victory. As the weeks passed, Daniel began to settle into the rhythm of the diner. Customers warmed up to him. Maria started calling him by name, and even Riley admitted, "You're growing on me, old man." Then one evening, just as Tom was locking up, Daniel approached him, a quiet determination in his eyes. "I got a place," he said. "Small, nothing fancy. But it's mine." Tom felt something tighten in his chest. Pride. "That's good," he said. "Real good." Daniel hesitated. "Couldn't have done it without this job." Tom shook his head. "No, you did it because you didn't give up." For the first time since they met, Daniel smiled real unguarded. And Tom knew, without a doubt, that offering him a second chance had been the right decision. It had been nearly a month since Daniel started working at the diner, and things were finally beginning to feel steady. He moved with quiet confidence now, fixing up things that needed fixing, helping Maria during the rush, even making small talk with customers. But not everyone was so quick to forget. One afternoon, just as the lunch crowd was dying down, the door swung open and Jess walked back in. The air shifted instantly. Conversation slowed. Maria stiffened behind the counter, and Riley shot a quick glance at Tom, who had just stepped out of the kitchen. Jess hadn't changed much, her arms still crossed in defiance, her expression still hard. But there was something else this time, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't look at Tom. Instead, her gaze landed directly on Daniel. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's working here now." The room went silent. Daniel, who had been wiping down a table, froze. Slowly, he set the cloth down and turned to face her. Tom stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Is there something you need, Jess?" She let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "I just came by to grab my last paycheck. Didn't think I'd walk in and see you playing charity case." She nodded toward Daniel. "Didn't peg you as the type to hand out pity jobs." Tom's jaw tightened. He could feel Maria's eyes on him, Riley's tension beside him. But he didn't need to respond, because Daniel did. "I don't need your pity," Daniel said, his voice steady. Jess scoffed. "Right. And I'm sure you earned that spot, huh? But you don't even know what you're doing here." Daniel didn't flinch, didn't shrink back. Instead, he straightened, his posture not one of defense but quiet strength. "Maybe I don't," he admitted, "but I'm trying. I show up every day. I put in the work, and that's more than you can say." A murmur rippled through the diner. Jess opened her mouth to fire back, but Tom stepped in. "You don't belong here, Jess." She turned on him. "Because I told the truth? Because I didn't want to waste my time on some washed up. Because you don't understand what this place stands for." Tom cut in, his voice unwavering. "This diner isn't just about food. It's about respect. It's about people who work hard, who show up for each other, who make this place better, not tear it down." Jess's face twisted with anger, but Tom wasn't done. "You were given a chance here, and you threw it away. Daniel, he was given a chance, and he's making the most of it. That's the difference between you two." Silence. Jess's hands clenched at her sides, but for the first time, she had nothing to say. She scoffed, rolled her eyes, and turned for the door. Whatever. This place was a joke anyway. The bell above the door jingled as she stormed out, leaving a thick, lingering tension behind. Tom turned to Daniel. "You all right?" Daniel nodded slowly, but Tom could see the tightness in his jaw. "Yeah," Daniel said after a moment. "I'm all right." And this time, Tom believed him. The tension in the diner lingered for a few moments after Jess's departure, like the final echoes of a storm that had just passed. Then, slowly, the atmosphere returned to normal. Conversations resumed. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air again. Maria muttered something under her breath about that girl needing to grow up before disappearing back into the kitchen. Tom turned to Daniel, who was still standing by the table, the rag loosely in his hand. "You sure you're okay?" Daniel nodded. But Tom could see something flickering beneath the surface, something that had less to do with Jess and more to do with the weight of everything that had brought him here. "I meant what I said," Daniel murmured after a pause. "I don't need anyone's pity." Tom studied him. "No one here is giving you pity, Daniel. You've earned your place. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Daniel exhaled, and something in his shoulders eased. That night, as they locked up the diner, Daniel lingered by the counter, hands in his pockets. "Tom," he said, hesitating for just a second, "you didn't have to give me this chance. You barely knew me." Tom wiped down the last of the tables before setting the rag aside. He thought about the men he had served with, the ones who came home only to find themselves lost, the ones who never got a second chance. "I know what it's like to wonder where you fit," Tom finally said. "And I know a good man when I see one." Daniel didn't say anything right away, but when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "I used to be somebody." Tom met his gaze. "You still are." A long silence stretched between them. And then, for the first time, Daniel looked like he believed it. A new beginning. The days passed, and Daniel settled further into the rhythm of the diner. He started greeting customers more openly, even sharing small conversations with the regulars. One elderly man, who always sat by the window, took a liking to him and started chatting about baseball. A young mother, who used to hesitate when he came by, now smiled and let him help carry extra plates to her table. Maria, who rarely softened, even began calling him Danny when she needed something in the kitchen. "You're officially part of the family now," Riley teased one morning. Daniel smirked. "Guess that means I'm stuck with you." Riley grinned. "Yeah, well, we all have our burdens." One evening, after closing, Tom found Daniel sitting outside on the diner's front steps, staring up at the sky. Tom sat down beside him, not saying anything at first. The night air was cool, the streets quiet. "You ever think about leaving?" Daniel asked suddenly. Tom glanced at him. "Leaving where?" Daniel shrugged. "This town. Starting over somewhere else." Tom exhaled, leaning back on his elbows. "I used to. After I left the service, I didn't know where I belonged. Thought maybe I'd just keep moving until I figured it out." Daniel nodded slowly. "What changed?" Tom gave a small smile. "I built this place, and I realized home isn't about where you are. It's about the people you surround yourself with." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Maybe I'll stick around a little longer," he finally said. Tom smirked. "Good. Maria would kill me if I let you leave." Daniel chuckled, a real, genuine laugh. And for the first time since he had walked into the diner, he looked like a man who had found something worth staying for. A final lesson. A few weeks later, on a particularly slow afternoon, an unfamiliar man walked into the diner. He looked tired, his clothes a little worn, his movements hesitant as he stepped inside. Daniel, who was cleaning a nearby table, noticed the way the man hovered near the entrance, as if unsure if he belonged. Without waiting, Daniel grabbed a menu and walked over. "Go ahead and take a seat," he said, sliding the menu onto the table. "Coffee's fresh." The man looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you," he said, settling into the booth. Tom watched from behind the counter, a slow smile forming on his lips. Daniel caught his gaze and raised an eyebrow. "What?" Tom shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "Just proud of you." Daniel didn't say anything, but Tom caught the small twitch at the corner of his mouth, the closest thing to a smile. And just like that, the cycle continued, because sometimes all a person needed was a second chance. And in this diner, as long as Tom was running it, they'd always find one. Months passed and the seasons shifted. The diner remained the heart of the small town, its neon sign flickering against the early evening sky. Inside, the hum of conversation blended with the clatter of dishes, the scent of warm coffee filling the air. Daniel was no longer the quiet man who had hesitated at the door that first night. He moved with confidence now, greeting customers by name, fixing what needed fixing, and making sure no one ever felt unwelcome. One evening, just as Tom was locking up, Daniel lingered by the counter, an envelope in his hands. "I saved up enough for a place of my own," he said, setting it down. "A real home." Tom looked at him, pride swelling in his chest. "That's good to hear." Daniel nodded, but he didn't look like a man who was leaving. "I think I'll stick around," he said after a beat. "The job suits me." Tom smirked, figured as much. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the neon glow of the sign reflecting in the window. "You did more than give me a job, Tom," Daniel finally said. "You gave me a place to belong." Tom patted his shoulder. "Then do the same for the next person who needs it." Daniel nodded, understanding. And as they turned off the lights and stepped into the night, the diner stood as a quiet beacon, a place where second chances weren't just given. They were earned.